Hi, my name is Emmanuel Chinder, and welcome to part 2 of Discovering Yourself Through Education. Well, last time, as I promised, I said that we're going to talk about some theories of education under the same topic of discovering yourself through education. Now, the reason why we're talking about these particular theories is that I remember years ago, in fact, not more than 2 years ago, I actually at university, I was studying education studies. It's called Education Studies and Theology. And we looked into theories of education, how these theories of education have influenced the different education systems that we have today around the world. So I'm just going to share, although it was at university, but I'm just going to simply share just in a simple way so that you get to actually understand the meaning of these particular theories and how they really for sure impact our lives even today. This applies to people who are in school, who are studying, and people who are not studying. So the first theory I'm going to talk about is called the labeling theory. The labeling theory. What do I mean by labeling? So when you go into a supermarket, when you pick up a can of baked beans, for example, that baked beans has got a label on it so that you will know what kind of baked beans it is. Same thing if you go to the supermarket or to the shop, or you want to buy some clothes, for example. The clothes usually have, in some cases, will have a label on them. So the label is it might show the size of the piece of clothes you want to buy. It will have the price as well. So basically, it gives you an idea of the value of that particular cloth. So we're going to be looking at the labeling theory at first. Now, in my studies, when we're looking at the labeling theory basically describes that the person lives to the expectation of the society based on how the society labels them. So, for example, in my case, when I was in primary school and when I went to high school, I was labeled as somebody who was average. So they said academically, I was like, 50-50. So I wasn't like, very like on the top, and I was not like at the bottom in terms of my academic performances. So because this is what I was told, by the teachers, by other students, and by people who were around me, I basically accepted that, oh, that's what I really am. And it was until I finished my my high school, that's when I realized later that I was basically living according to the expectations or according to what I have been labeled. Because what then happened was that I discovered that when I was in university, we had to kind of depend on, studying for ourselves. The lectures would give us the lectures, but the lectures would not label us to say, okay, this is how you are. I think you're average. I think we're all put on the same plane. Whereas in primary and secondary school, we were put in different classes. So if you were like the star student, you were then put in your own group in your own class. If you were average, you were put in your own group in your own class. If you struggled, you were put in your own group in your own class. The same thing happened with sports as well. You'd either play for the first team, you either played for the second team, or you'd either play for the other team. So people then performed according to how people said, oh, this is how you are. Now, the reality is that society can label you, can then say to you, well, you know what, your education is not for you, so just you're just going to school. The best thing is for you is just to, you know, become something else, like, just looking to becoming you know, a milkman, or become a cleaner, because they don't require qualifications or anything like that. In some countries they label that, but the reality of it is that that's not really who you are. So if you're going to accept what people have labeled you, then you're just going to live according to the expectation of society. So if people label you as a failure, then, you know, you're just going to accept it. So you must then work hard to actually prove them wrong. And there are ways of actually doing that. And, education is one way that can help you to discover who you really are, not what society says you are. Now, I'm going to talk about the second theory. This theory is called self-fulfilling prophecy. So when people have already put a label on you to say, okay, you are average or you're not good enough, some people will not study for the exams, for example, because they'll think, well, I'm already not good enough, so I'm just gonna, what's the point for me to read? Because whatever I get to read, it doesn't work anyway. And then the student who performs average, like I was, I'll just be like, well, since I'm average, I'll just have to read a little bit. I don't have to read too much because I'm average anyway. If I try to read a lot more, I'll still get the same sort of marks anyway. And so what ends up happening is that, for sure, the one who says there's no point to study, they will definitely fail. The one who says, let me read a little bit, they will get some marks, probably average or below average. The one who says that, well, I'm going to read, I'm going to work very, very hard in my studies because I'm the top student, I'm aiming to get the highest mark, they then live according to that particular prophecy, as it is called. The same thing as in, like, when people are labeled as, well, you're not a very good sports person, you're not going to be good in sports, you're not going to be good in acting. Shockingly, I've been reading so many biographies of some of the most famous people today, and they share the same story, that society had already labeled them or had given them prophecy to say, well, you know what, you're not going to be good at acting. Just go and look for a different job. Go and work at McDonald's. Go and do something else. Go and join the army. And these people, they refused to believe and accept that. They thought, no way, I'm going to keep on fighting. I'm going to keep on working very, very hard to prove you that I'm good at this. Why? Because they realized that they had a passion for that particular area which they were told they were not good enough. And so they worked very, very hard to prove them wrong. So they had a passion for that, and they continued. They were persistent. So the word is persistent. And eventually doors opened before them, an opportunity came, and they would discover that, wow, these are the best, sort of like, this person is very good at acting, or this person is very good at sports. I can give examples of people like Michael Jordan is an example. When in his school, they told him that, well, they actually kicked him out. They said he was not very good enough in that particular sport. Today, Michael Jordan is a legend. He's a legend at basketball, plays for the National Basketball Association in the United States of America. So these are examples about self-fulfilling prophecy. So the first one was the labeling theory, when people give you a label to say, oh, this is who you are, you're not good enough. The self-fulfilling prophecy is when you believe the negative, to think, oh dear, I'm not good at this. And for sure, you don't do anything about it. And for sure, you will fail, or you will not become a success in that particular area of your interest. So those particular theories they do exist in the in both education system, in the mainstream education system, and even in the self education sort of system environment. They also exist in society. But the question is, what would you do about them? And the way forward is to discover who you really are by education. Identify through your education where your passion lies, what you're really interested in, what you're really good at. So make a list of things that you're interested in. It could be things within your school environment. It could be things outside of school. It could be when you're sitting down watching news or watching TV, you might discover you're interested in watching news reporters, or you've got people that you like who are like sports person. Could be a cricketer, it could be a footballer. You might be interested in becoming a writer. You might be interested in finance. You might be interested in doing business. Just make a list of things that you are interested in, as you are right now, that you're interested in, and then look at the areas that you feel that, okay, because I'm interested in this, and I think I'm good at doing A, B, C, D. So, for example, I'm interested in business. I think I'm very good with money. I think I'm very good with negotiating. So just make the list of those things. If you find that you're interested in business, but there's so many things you're not able to, then self-educate yourself. Learn the things you're not good at. Start reading newspapers. Start looking at other business people. What did they do? How did they become successful? And you can look for a mentor, somebody who can be your mentor, who has been successful, and start following that particular path. So those are ways you can actually get to discover, yourself, who you really are. So that's basically what is covered under the theories. So I'm going to then ask you a question. So from what I said in part 1 and what I've said in the last few minutes, who are you? Are you just a young person? Are you just a student? Are you just a child? Are you just an ordinary person like everybody else? Are you just what society labels you to be? Or through the education systems, have you discovered that you are a politician, possibly? You are a sports personality, possibly. You are an inventor. You're probably an entrepreneur. You're probably a professional, like a teacher. You're probably an engineer. You're probably a lawyer, a doctor, possibly a journalist. The question is, who are you, or who do you think you are? If you can't answer that question yet, then it's important for you to start making steps to discover who you are. Because if you don't discover who you are, then society is going to label you. That's the labeling theory. If you don't discover who you are, then you're going to become a victim of self-fulfilling prophecy, where you yourself, because you have accepted a label, or you think you're not good enough, you're just going to proclaim and accept that, well, I'm just a failure. And for sure, you live like that particular failure. But I challenge you today to refuse. Refuse being labeled, number one. Refuse being labeled. Refuse to believe the prophecy that you are not going to succeed. Refuse from that. And when you make that decision, start working hard in the mainstream education where you are. Start working hard, self-educating yourself. There's so many resources out there. There's library resources. There are seminars you could possibly attend. There are videos you can get to watch on YouTube which are useful. You can find information on the internet that you can use to actually discover and get more knowledge upon the knowledge you're receiving in school and become somebody. It doesn't matter what age you are, you're not too young. There's some people who became successful. They discovered who they were at a very young age. Trust me, there are people who they get to the age of like 30, 40. They then discover, wow, I was not meant to be a human resources manager. I was meant to be a doctor. And this is true in the example where I worked with a lady before, and she was a human resources manager for a very big company called John Lewis. And it was later, I was working with her in one particular hospital those years, and she mentioned that she was a human resources manager. And I said, well, why then have you left that job and you're in a hospital and you're going to university? She's like, well, I decided to go to university because, I discovered that I so much want to become a doctor. I was, my passion and my purpose is to be a doctor, not to be a human resources manager. And at that point in her life, she was like in her 30s. So she was going to spend the next 6 years, probably 7 years, pursuing the studies, gaining the practicals to eventually become a doctor, of which then she would become a doctor at 40 years of age, which is still okay, which it doesn't matter. But it means the number of years that she would spend being a doctor are fewer than if she had known before. She would have spent more years, in that field of medicine. So that is why at the age where you are, it is very important to discover who you are through the different education systems that you have been exposed to you. Now, when you get the knowledge of who you are, then you will get the knowledge of your value. Remember the story I told you about that old retired engineer who was on a ship, and on that particular ship, the engine stopped working. And the people on the ship were stuck. They had some other engineers, they couldn't start the ship. And they couldn't get help. And the retired engineer went to the captain and he said, oh, what will you do for the person who actually gets this engine working? And the captain said, we'll pay them anything really because we are stuck. The engineer then said, take me to the engine room. They went to the engine room. He asked for a hammer. He was given a hammer. Then he gave the engine a knock. And he said, start the engine. The engine started working. And everybody was happy. They continued their journey. And then they said, okay, give us the invoice. How much should we pay you? Then he wrote down a shocking amount. He wrote down $100,000. And the captain said, wow, that's a lot of money for just knocking the engine. The retired engineer said, well, Captain, the thing is this. I only charged you $1 for knocking on the engine, but I charged you $99,999 for the knowledge of where to hit on the engine, because your engineers, they tried everything on the engine, knocking it, but they didn't know the exact point where to knock. So because of my experience, I knew where to hit, and that's why we're moving. So the captain agreed, said that's right, and then he got his wages. He was paid, in fact, 100,000, as he had put on the invoice. Now I'm just going to read you a scripture in the book of 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 15. This was written by a very well-known, educated Christian apostle called Paul. He said, study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. So you see, even the apostle Paul studied. He encouraged people to study. So self-education is important. Studying through self-education or self-study is very important. So even outside of school, you must study. And that way it will help you to discover who you are. Same as when you study the different books, even studying the Bible, it will help you discover who you really are as a Christian or who you really are in Christ. So studying is the key of discovering yourself through education. Now, I'm going to end by asking you these questions, which I want you to write down. So question number 1 is, what does it mean to discover yourself? What does it mean to discover yourself? Question number 2, list some positive things about yourself. List some positive things about yourself. Question number 3, why is it important to discover yourself? Why is it important to discover yourself? Number 4, what systems of education can help you discover yourself or your value? What systems of education can help you discover yourself or your value? Next question, name 2 theories of education. Name 2 theories of education. The last question, what instruction did the educated Apostle Paul write to Timothy in the scripture 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 15? Well, thank you very much for listening, and hope to meet with you again in the next series of different videos. But it's important for you to discover who you really are through education. Thank you. Goodbye.